Okay, there we are. In today's lesson, I'm gonna comment on this article that I found almost by chance surfing the net. Why 43% of British still think colonial empire was a good thing and a source of pride. So basically, this article somehow makes us think back of Victorian England, because the British Empire reached its maximum during the very long reign of Queen Victoria. Victoria ruled over such a huge empire. You have to think that 1/4 of the world's population was ruled by Queen Victoria during the 70 years running from 1830 to approximately 1901. Okay, so during the reign of Queen Victoria, the British Empire reached its maximum, and Queen Victoria herself was so proud of her empire that she wanted to be called Empress of India. So not only was she the Queen of England and the queen of such a huge empire, but what she called the jewel on her crown was one of the lands that the British had colonized, that is Britain, that is India, sorry. The age of Queen Victoria was a really rich, a really balanced and peaceful period for this nation, and probably this is the main reason why, from the scientific and technological point of view, England reached the top. And in fact, in 1851, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, decided to have a huge palace built, and it was called the Crystal Palace. And in this palace, he decided to hold a great exhibition. So you have probably heard of this 1851 Great Exhibition. What was the use of such a massive exhibition? Showing the British how large the British Empire was, showing products coming from Australia, from New Zealand, from India, from everywhere in the British Empire, so that the British might somehow learn to be proud of their empire. And this article seems to suggest that British people still are, even today, even in 2021, that is 1 century after Queen Victoria's reign, they are still proud of the British Empire. And why is that so? Because the British held this principle that the British Empire was a way of exporting civilization. During the Victorian age, it was common to read books, pamphlets, novels, poems, showing the British as good men. Western white men were good people who made a huge sacrifice. What sacrifice? Moving to these faraway lands, India, America, Oceania, and bring the superior European civilization to these savage people. We will meet a writer whose name is Roger Kipling, who is world famous for writing novels such as Kim and the very famous Jungle Book. But he also wrote a poem, a seven-stanza poem called The White Man's Burden. What is the main theme in this seven-stanza poem? The main theme is white man brings his superior Western civilization to these savage people, and this is a sacrifice, this is a mission. So imperialism was justified as a mission. This was in open contrast with those who thought that imperialism was not a good thing, because imperialism meant that Europeans were somehow stealing lands from other peoples everywhere, and this was basically an act of oppression. It was a horrible act of oppression performed by Western white peoples. Among these intellectuals, among these writers, we have to mention a Polish writer from the Polish Ukraine, whose name was Joseph Conrad. He did not make an apology of imperialism, not at all. He made an indictment. He accused Europeans of bringing this oppression to innocent, to a little bit naive peoples who lived in somehow all the corners of the world. We can, for example, mention the American Indians, and we may think back of what happened when the English Puritans, the so-called Pilgrim Fathers, had to escape after the restoration of the monarchy. Probably you will remember something about Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Puritans. We must go back to the 17th century, the 20 years between 1740 and 1760, the only period of time when England ceased to be a monarchy and it became some kind of republic, the so-called Commonwealth, which was led by Oliver Cromwell, who made himself the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. Well, even the British Empire during the reign of Queen Victoria kept this definition. It was called the British Commonwealth. This was a way of making these peoples who were subject to the British rule as somehow friends to England, friends to the English, to the British. This is something we already saw happening at the time of the Roman Empire. Even Romans, when their empire was in danger, suggested this idea that the Roman Empire was some kind of confederation, some kind of union in which the different nations somehow kept their dignity. This was a way of trying to keep the empire together. This happened even to the British Empire, but you know that in the 20th century, mostly after World War II, all these African countries, India, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, started becoming independent. So they are independent now. We do not have any British Empire anymore, even though we can find trace of what used to be the British Empire. For example, if you think of the Australian flag, you will find the Union Jack still there as some kind of reminder that Australia is a former British colony. Australia used to be a British colony. Okay, so one aspect of the so-called Victorian contradictions is this conception of imperialism. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Was imperialism a mission that Europeans and British people in particular had to perform, that is, exporting civilization, bringing Western white civilization to these different peoples? Or was it a bad thing? Was it an act of oppression? This is a first compromise, we should say, between two different opinions. Another aspect of Victorian contradictions was the way Victorians looked at themselves. During the reign of Queen Victoria, Victorians proved to be real moralizers. They were so deeply interested in preserving their public image. They wanted to be as respectable as possible. The Victorian era was basically sexophobic. It was not convenient to talk about sex, to even make allusions to sex. I'd like you to surf the net once again and go and check what armchairs, chairs, tables were like. Chairs and tables have legs, and as the legs of chairs and tables could make people think of, for example, the legs of a woman, it was convenient to have these legs covered with cloth. This may sound crazy. How can the leg of a chair, of a table, make me think of the leg of a human being, and so somehow make me think of sex? But this can give you an idea of how obsessed Victorians were. Obsession is a key word to understand Victorians. What does obsession mean? This word has a Latin origin, obsidio. Obsidio means a prisoner. So when one is obsessed with something, don't forget, obsessed with, not obsessed by, obsessed with something. If someone is obsessed with sex, it means that he or she has a one-track mind. His mind is constantly set on this idea, on this thought, sex, sex, sex. She sees sex everywhere. So this makes this person unobsessed. And Victorians were all like that. What did this lead to? We will find Victorian personalities who led a double life. They used to have a wife and some kids in London, but they secretly cultivated other love affairs, probably outside London, in the countryside, in country villages, country towns around London, where they introduced themselves even with different names in order to preserve their respectability. So Victorians had, we may say, three lives: a public life, a private life, and a secret life. So their public life, we can mention the famous protagonist of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which you probably have heard of. Who's Dr. Henry Jekyll? Henry Jekyll was a respectable scientist, and all he cared of was preserving his respectability. But he also was a scientist, and as a scientist, he started posing the question, I feel there's a part of me, a dark side of me, which needs to express itself. But if I let this dark side of me express itself, this part of me will take over me, and my respectability is gonna be destroyed. It's gonna be shattered, because if I follow these bad drives of mine, these unacceptable vices, if I start getting drunk, if I start visiting prostitutes, if I start going to dirty pubs where people go and get drunk and smoke and meet prostitutes and have sex, okay, what are other people gonna think of me? That I am a bad guy, that I am not a decent guy, so my respectability is gonna be destroyed. So, as a scientist, she starts thinking of a way of getting rid, of freeing himself from these dark, negative, socially unacceptable drives, impulses that he feels inside himself. And so he has this great idea of splitting his personality into two men, two different creatures. So, side by side with Dr. Henry Jekyll, we're gonna meet Mr. Edward Hyde. As his name suggests, he has to hide. But look, Hyde is spelled with a Y. So it is pronounced hide like the verb to hide, but it's spelled with a Y. So Edward Hyde appears every time Henry Jekyll secretly drinks a potion. He creates a potion that changes his face, his body, and lets this alter ego, we should say in Latin, this second self of his emerge, so that Jekyll disappears and he turns into another man, Edward Hyde. Think that even the servants, because Henry Jekyll is a respectable and rich scientist, he lives in the rich part of London, in the West End. You know that London has a lot of cities, is somehow this idea of splitting the two sides of a man's personality into a bright side, a respectable side, a socially acceptable side, that is Henry Jekyll, and a second part, the dark side of a man, Mr. Hyde. Doesn't it make you think of our buildings, the palaces we live in? They also have two facades. You have the front facade of a building, which is always perfect, and the back of our houses, of our buildings, where everything can happen, because nobody can see it from the street. So even our cities, we have usually the central area of a city that is always perfect. It is always kept clean. You see people cleaning the streets in the city center, in the central, socially acceptable part of a city. On the other hand, if you move to the suburbs, another Latin word, urbis, that is the lowest side part of a town, it is not as clean, as perfect, as decent as the central part of a town. So this is another main feature of Victorians. They have a double personality. They know that inside them they feel the pressure of these impulses, these drives, these instincts, but they know that these impulses need to be repressed, need to be suffocated, otherwise they're gonna lose their respectability. They would become socially unacceptable. So this is the second side of the so-called Victorian compromise. So Victorians always had to somehow struggle between two poles. Let us recap what we have just said. Imperialism, is it good or bad? Victorians, are they moral or immoral? The answer is they are moral, respectable in their surface. So they are basically hypocritical. They are hypocritical people. They are hypocrites. Don't forget that the adjective is hypocritical. The noun is a hypocrite. So I can either say you're a hypocrite or you're a hypocritical person. Okay, so they are hypocritical people because want to they want to be proud of the opinion other people have of them, their public image. Their public life has to be simply perfect. A family, a wife, some kids, they go to church any given Sunday. You can see them going to church every Sunday, but they find during their day an hour, 2 hours to escape from this public life and the public image they have built, and they go just like Edward Hyde does. They go to the suburbs, they go to the worst areas of the city, probably looking for prostitutes, probably looking for sex they could buy. Probably they went to these suburbs where nobody could recognize them to get drunk. They wanted to get drunk. So they can be defined as alienated people, obsessed with their respectability, but their respectability becomes a prison. So they live like prisoners of that image they have built of themselves. Okay, but they knew that it was hard to repress those other unspeakable, we may say, desires they had. Probably they were animal-like desires, and in fact, Edward Hyde has the looks of an animal, short, covered with hairs everywhere, a hairy body, short. So an animal-like. When Edward Hyde first appears, the very first time Dr. Jekyll drinks the potion, Hyde seems like an animal. It's the animal-like part of a man. Okay, so these are the main features of the so-called Victorian compromise.